Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to wait a minute just to let some few other folks trickle in, and then we'll begin today's discussion. All right, I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good early morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I know we've got folks in some different time zones. And thank you all for joining us for the latest installment of our Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's conversation is focused on using the science of reading to teach all learners. My name is Michael Sheehy, and I'm a policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute on the K-12 team. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and we serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the entire education spectrum through both in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. Now, before we get the conversation started today, I want to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start with a moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll pivot into a Q&A with our audience for the latter half of this for the session. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the latter half of our discussion today. Additionally, we will be recording this conversation and in the next couple of days, be posting it on our YouTube channel. Now, we also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. We will also be live tweeting from our Twitter account at Hunt_Institute. Now, speaking of today's conversation, we are so appreciative of the panelists who have taken time out of their very busy schedules to join us for today's discussion. Throughout the last 40 years, there have been numerous studies around how students learn to read and the best methods for teaching and instructing reading. The science of reading gets to the heart of these issues and is essentially the converging evidence of what matters and what works in literacy instruction. This body of has shown that evidence-based early literacy instruction should be tailored to the specific needs of students in order to be most effective. And research has shown that reading proficiency is critical to both later academic achievement and life success. As students who are proficient by the third grade, proficient in reading by the third grade, are 4 times more likely to graduate and succeed in their careers. Additionally, research has shown that the science of reading has shown that English learners, as well as students with disabilities, benefit from the same essential components of literacy instruction as their peers, as long as they're provided the necessary additional support systems. Now, in the wake of the pandemic and in the context of steep national declines in reading proficiency, it is evident that ensuring all students can read proficiently is vital to the future success of the communities in which these students will one day live and work. Now, ensuring our students are adequately and effectively teaching our children to read is top of mind for us here at the Hunt Institute. The Hunt Institute's Across the Aisle initiative and research has found that voters are heavily in favor of the use of evidence-based literacy instruction and interventions. And 73% of voters say that ensuring students are reading at grade level is very important. Many states and education stakeholders are working to adopt and incorporate more evidence-based literacy practices to support learning recovery, as evidenced by the Hunt Institute's work on the Path Forward, which supports states in their efforts to transform teacher preparation and teacher licensure programs to include the science of reading. Whew, a lot to discuss with our panelists. In today's discussion, we will explore how the science of reading and evidence-based early literacy instruction ensures that all students have access to the necessary resources to thrive in the classroom and beyond. To that end, I am pleased to introduce our full panel of speakers today. We have Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagan, who is the president of Valley Speech Language and Learning Center in Brownsville, Texas. Dr. Amelia Malone, who is the director of research and innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. State Superintendent Kristen Baszler, who's the State Superintendent of Education for the wonderful state of North Dakota. And finally, Dr. Malt Joshi, who is a professor of education at Texas A&M University. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And with that, that is enough of me, hopefully, for the rest of the session, and we will jump right into the conversation. And again, for our audience, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. So, Dr. Joshi, this first question is for you. I'd love to send this your way. You've spoken about a reading crisis that is happening right now and the importance of evidence-based early literacy instruction in preparing children for many indicators of future success. Can you share with us a little about the correlation between poor reading skills in early elementary and outcomes later in life?
Okay, I shall try. And first of all, thank you for inviting me in this August group of panel members. Yeah, there are plenty of evidence about the poor reading and success in life. And, I thought of sharing my screen just to show some evidence of what we know. And we know that 1/3 of the fourth graders are not reading as well as they should. And this is percentage even goes up among minority and inner city school children. And 25% of adults are not able to read the newspaper. And so illiteracy or not being able to read and write, it affects all parts of life. In fact, many of you may know that we have an agency called National Institute of Health. They monitor what we should do, and they have called illiteracy is a public health issue because 50% of adolescents with criminal problems and history of substance abuse problems have reading problems. And, it can be kind of a chicken or the egg problem. Are they having problem because they cannot read, or they cannot read, that's why they are having problem. In juvenile court system, 85% of the people there are functionally illiterate. That is, they cannot read above fourth grade level. And 70% of prison inmates cannot read the same level. But if you give them help with reading, writing, spelling, there are only 16% chance that they will return to the prison. But if you don't help them, 70% will return to the prison system. So we know that teaching, reading, writing, spelling really helps the individual. And if you don't want people to come back to prison, teach them to read. I'm not saying that we'll solve 100% of the problem, but as you can see, only 16% of them shall return. And then, because we are paying for all of this, you and I paying, it costs about $25,000 per year So, and for juvenile offenders, it is even higher. And healthcare expenses also, I don't want to go into detail about this, but this is self-explanatory. If you have an education of third grade and below, it costs about $11,000 per year. But if you have an education level of fourth grade, it only costs $3,000. So you can see it is about the difference 1 to 3 times. And it costs a lot of money for illiteracy, and we are paying for that. And interestingly, if you have an high school education, if you can read and write and finish high school, your onset of dementia is postponed by 4 years. And if you have a high school diploma or not, if you don't have an even high school diploma, the dementia will set up even much earlier. So reading and writing skills are very important. And on top of this, we have the solution. We know how to solve this problem. It is not kind of some cancer or some diseases that we can throw up our hands and say, I can't help this person, but we have the, the tools to solve this problem, but we are not doing that. So as you can see that not being able to read and write has grave concern in the human life, and it affects the individual, it affects the society, and it affects the nation. And that's why National Institute of Health called that a national public health issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. Very harrowing to see some of those statistics, but also very powerful to just see how much of a lever literacy can be for improving outcomes. So thank you so much for sharing. Superintendent Baszler, this next question is for you. We know that no one reading program can meet the needs of all learners, yet many districts across the country purchase comprehensive early literacy programs for schools to implement. How can we empower teachers to provide evidence-based instruction based on individual student needs when the provided, or in some cases required, programs do not meet all of those needs? Oh, and I think you're muted.
I knew I was going to do that, and I promised myself that I wouldn't, and I did it anyway. Thank you, Michael. So I really appreciate this question by just calling out one of the problems in this. It's like that. Let's just start out by saying that this isn't something that you can purchase. And so how do we empower teachers? We give them what they need to be empowered, but we must. And this is what our teachers are telling us. This is what our educators are telling us. And they're telling anybody at their local level, their board members, their building principals, anybody that will listen, that this is not something that you purchase. It's nothing that you can purchase off the shelf and that will be the silver bullet. And, one of the best examples that educators provide to me, and the best examples that when people, I think when they're appropriators, whether it be a local school board appropriator or a state level appropriator, they will give the example of, something that I think we're probably all familiar with as adult human beings, and that's weight management, right? Whether it's weight loss or weight gain. And you might be purchasing that treadmill, and you might purchase that gym membership, or you might purchase that gummy off the internet that's going to be your miracle. But it really isn't about that gym membership that you purchase or that treadmill that you purchase and put in your basement. If you don't change your lifestyle and you don't change your habits of the way you're doing things, none of your outcomes will change. And so our educators are clearly telling us that this is a lifestyle change. It is about a learned teacher skill and providing our teachers the supports, the training, the knowledge, just like we do about proper nutrition, providing them the training, the knowledge, and the supports that they need to have this lifestyle change of changing their instructional habits. I will be honest and just say, there is no perfect curriculum, and not very many people can be maybe in the position that I'm in as an elected state leader, now being the state chief for 12 years. But I'm going to tell you that vendors are going to tell you that. Every vendor will tell you that they have it all. Just purchase this and your teachers will have what they need to embrace and deploy and implement the science of reading. And that just isn't true. So let's just call out what the question asks, is that there will be, it will take a variety, a combination of strategies and resources and supports from a variety of different programs to meet the needs of all of our students. And so how can we do that? How can we really empower teachers to grab those resources, to have access to those resources, to actually be the experienced instructors with the training, the knowledge, the habits, and the skill sets that are necessary to change these outcomes for all of our teachers, or excuse me, for all of our learners? And that's training. Train educators in science training, PLCs, and assessment efficiencies. That's the 3 areas that I think that we are focusing on based on what our educators are telling us. Train those educators in the scientifically based approaches to reading instruction that are program agnostic. Program agnostic. When educators understand the skills they are teaching and have lesson templates that walk them through preparing an effective lesson, they will themselves be able to evaluate the quality of and the content of the materials available and make adjustments for each of the children in front of them. There are a number of free online resources that provide supplementary support aligned with the science of reading. I've put a couple of those in our chat, and maybe we can share that with the broader audience, but those are free. There's nothing that you need to purchase. If your school won't provide quality resources, educators could be guided to those resources, which may help them provide the curricula of the resources that are provided to them in areas that might be weak or even misaligned in too many cases. Professional learning committees, communities are they're called PLCs, but some people use communities, some people use committees, but whatever you call them, support the building and district level team approaches to this continuous improvement of literacy instruction. Train and support educators in working in these PLCs. And I would say that grade level teams that are critically evaluating the materials that they are using against their student results and against what they have learned in that support and instruction, they are the masters of this then. Functioning PLCs work together to pinpoint curricular and instructional weaknesses and strengths to adjust their and improve their outcomes. And then finally, the assessment efficiency. Ensure that your educators understand the efficient assessment approaches, which reveal group and individual instructional needs. Districts and buildings should carefully design assessment approaches to drive this efficiency. I'll just close by saying that teachers are smarter than any purchased curriculum. And when you provide those teachers with the knowledge, skills, and support that they need, that is where the art of teaching meets the science of reading.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. What an incredible, inspirational speech with a healthy dose of reality and an incredible metaphor that I will probably be stealing in regards to your treadmill metaphor. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. Dr. Malone, this next question I would love to send your way. Many special education programs have embraced the science of reading principles for decades, and the shift in the culture of education poses an opportunity to foster conversations between general and special educators, especially since most students with learning disabilities spend 80% or more of their time in the general education classroom learning alongside their peers. What mindset level shifts are needed in order to foster this relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I think Superintendent Basler really set me up for success with all of her lovely comments. So I'm just going to bridge and expand on that a little bit. So first off, I think in order to have these effective PLC opportunities, we need to ensure that we are discussing data, discussing progress monitoring, and discussing how we are integrating the science of reading across both our general educators and our special educators. A lot of the research that has come out on the science of reading has come from special educators like myself, looking for the best ways to teach students reading and math principles. I know we're talking about reading, but I always add in math because I'm a math person, as well as reading, don't worry. And, we have learned kind of the nuanced ways in which we can shift instruction, capitalize on students' strengths to fill in their gaps. And we cannot do that without mindset shifts within the building and a robust multi-tiered system of supports integrated at the district and school level. If we have that robust data collection at the individual, school, and district level, we can assess, like Superintendent Basler just indicated, where our district gaps are, where our school gaps are, where are we struggling at tier 1 or in that general education space. It's imperative that we think critically about extending our support in the general education classroom in tier 1 and focus on evidence-based instruction at the group level so that our tier 2 or our more targeted supports for students who are not adequately responding to that instruction can coincide with what they're learning in the classroom. And if those students are still not responding adequately to that targeted intensive instruction, then we think more deeply about what they need. Do they need an increased dosage, greater comprehensive support? Do we need to decrease the group size for our students? All of that needs to be integrated so that students can go fluidly from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 and receive more intensive instruction throughout those tiers that's not different than the general education classroom, just rather more intense and maybe providing more practice, more support, and whatever is commensurate with the student's needs at that time. I also want to make mention, and I loved Superintendent Basler's metaphor to a lifestyle change. I'm advocating also for a mindset shift. I think that you have to do that before you can change your lifestyle. So we change our mindsets at a collective level as educators, and then we build from there. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means. And so I know we're going to get to this later, but sometimes people hear the science of reading and they think that it's yet another program, as we just talked about. But really, it's a set of processes, a set of robustly researched principles that we actually know works for students under a range of conditions. And we know if students are struggling in certain areas across the core principles of reading, that we can intervene on those particular areas. It's not a simple process. Reading is hard. I actually just want to say that. We are not meant to read. Some people say reading is not rocket science. In fact, sometimes it is. It's so incredibly challenging. And if we all change our mindset to believe that and to understand how hard reading is for many of our students, we can all build a bridge across what's known and what can be done in order to bridge our academic achievement gaps across our most marginalized populations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. Truly a mindset shift. Powerful words, so thank you so much. Dr. Cardenas-Hagan, I'd love to shift the conversation to you before I pose a question to all of our panelists, but I would love to hear from you first. There are more than 5 million English learners in public school today. You have noted that it is critical for teachers of early literacy to understand the evidence-based practices for developing English literacy skills among this diverse population of students. How does adopting cross-linguistic frameworks for developing language and literacy skills, such as phonological awareness, decoding, vocabulary, oral language, comprehension, ensure that English learning students are given the same opportunity to succeed as their native English-speaking peers?
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, wow, thank you to Dr. Joshi for bringing up why this issue is so important for all students, but it is especially important for these students from diverse populations because we see that they are overrepresented also in this population as we look at, our school, our prison population. And the other thing, thank you, Superintendent Basler, at when you discuss and talk about teachers teach, right? It's not the programs that teach. That's so essential. And Dr. Malone, you talked about data and you talked about that progress monitoring and this multi-tiered system of support. So as we think about that, and as we think about students, the 5 million students, and by the way, close to 80% of them speak Spanish as their first language. And as we have started in the year 2000 by what Dr. Joshi mentioned, the National Institute of Health, Child Health and Human Development, it was the first biliteracy research network where $30 million were allocated to really begin to look very carefully at this population of students, primarily Spanish-speaking English learners. And I just want to dispel the myth right here and now for all of you out there to hear. We have a body of evidence for these students from diverse populations. You may have heard otherwise, but $100 million have been spent on this since, these National Institute of Child Health, the United States Department of Education, Institute for Education Sciences, the Office of Special Education Programs. And what have we learned? What did we learn about this population of students as we studied the student? We studied their families, their context, the schools, and what they were receiving and what kind of interventions would help them to get up to level. And what we find is that students can learn, and that if we give that targeted instruction, if we know the student, like you were talking about, the data, Dr. Malone, having the data, on that. Superintendent Basler was talking about having the assessment tools that would be appropriate for that. But what we have found about cross-linguistic transfer is, yes, that when we are working with these students, it's not business as usual. Every teacher will come across an English learner. I am confident of that. And every teacher must be knowledgeable about first language acquisition and second language acquisition and figure out what are the cross-linguistic relationships that I can build upon. Michael, you mentioned phonology and phonological awareness. If I looked at Spanish, the most common language of our English learners, right? What we know is that English has about 44 sounds, right? Some might say 46. Spanish has about 22 sounds. Some might say 24, but it's double the number of sounds. So what can I do? I can make connections. Hey, you already have these sounds in your language. Let's relate that. Now, these sounds, they form words. Did you know we have so many words that are similar across languages, especially between Spanish and English? We have so many letters and sounds in alphabetic languages that are similar, but even in languages that are non-alphabetic, right? Languages that are non-alphabetic, there are common sounds across this. So we start with, what do they know? Let's build upon the assets that they have, right? And I use often a website called mylanguages.org to really look at all these languages and how they're related to the English language if I'm focused on English language and literacy. And I make those connections, whether it be Arabic or Vietnamese or Ukrainian or Russian, what have you. But I also can make connections of these students. Now, I will tell you, the majority of these students are serviced in English as a second language classrooms. They're focused on English literacy. We would love for our country to have, at least biliteracy as a goal, but they are serviced in primarily English classrooms teaching English literacy. So what else can we build upon? What kind of cross-linguistic connections do we have for vocabulary? We want to build the vocabulary. They have resources, and those resources have to do with the morphological units of the language. Languages have meaningful units, right? And so between Spanish and English, about 60% of the English language comes from Latin. And all of these words that we have, fancy words in English that are about 4 or 5 syllables, are often Latin words. And so what we know is that we can build upon this, but it doesn't magically happen. Teachers must make those connections. And First, they have to know the connections in order to teach them. I'm not saying you have to know their language, but know something about the structure of their language so you can make those cross-linguistic connections with our students, right? And we can also build that background knowledge. They bring so many resources, right? Our families are our connections to those resources. Let's know our students, know our families, know their resources, because we want to get at their culture and we want to be culturally and linguistically responsive. To be culturally responsive isn't going to teach you to read. What does it do for us? It engages our students. It makes them see, I am someone here that's important. I am valued. Linguistic responsiveness, we know that that relates to language development and literacy development. So that's our job. Our job as teachers is to know what are those connections and how can I build them in? What about that structure of the language can help support this other structure of the language? Does that answer your question?
Wow, it does, Dr. Cardenas-Hagan. Thank you so much. And the the my big takeaway there is really just like centering and prioritizing the power of connections as that bridge. Figuring out what we have in common is really the strength behind a lot of these evidence-based solutions. So
And
thank
taking it from an asset point of view and not a deficit. And Dr. Joshi talked about if you read the onset of dementia, if you are multiliterate or multilingual, the onset of dementia and Alzheimer is delayed about an extra 5 years because we're doing all this cognitive work and keeping our brain active. We're keeping it exercised.
exercise, big theme of today. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I would love before we hop into the Q&A and just take in some questions from the audience, I would love to ask a follow-up of you all. And as a reminder to our audience, please feel free to submit your questions at the bottom of your screen using the Q&A feature. But as you all have alluded to, the science of reading can sometimes be misconstrued or and is often misunderstood. What recommendations do you have for how educators who may be on the call with us today, for how they communicate what the science of reading is to skeptics or those who may not buy into its findings? What strategies might you have for navigating this resistance? And Dr. Malone, I would love to send that question to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I would highlight is to discuss that in order to reach every individual child, we have to take a multifaceted approach that capitalizes on an array of skills or an array of reading or literacy foundational skills, including their ability to discern individual sounds, their phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, their phonics ability, their ability to discern words. Can they understand where a sentence ends? Can they blend? Can they manipulate sounds? Those kinds of things. I kind of want to allude, and I hate to bring this example in, but if you think about a child riding a bike, they don't know how to ride a bike at the very beginning, right? We have to teach them what a bike is. We have to show them the mechanics of the bike. We have to let them practice. We often have to let them fall off the bike. And then eventually they become confident enough to be able to go out on their own. And sometimes mishaps occur and we have to reteach, rethink, reassess, reevaluate, and we get them on the road again. Reading in some ways, and the science of reading is the same thing. It's explicit and systematic instruction on the building blocks of understanding how to discern individual sounds, individual words, putting all of that knowledge together to both decode, encode, and eventually understand what you're reading. So if there are individuals skeptical of the science of reading, I would argue that it's imperative that we teach kids what we expect them to know, and we hold their hand when needed, and we let them go when they are good to go. So it's a process that we must go through in order to get them into skilled, literate readers who, like Dr. Joshi indicated, will be successful in life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malone. Dr. Cardenas-Hagan, any thoughts from your point of view? Oh, and I think you're on mute.
Okay, Superintendent, you weren't the only one. I'll join your club. All right. So I'm so glad you asked about, what does that science of reading mean and what does it mean for, this diverse population of students? And I want to give you homework. Dr. Malone mentioned about those key components of a comprehensive approach to literacy. She spoke about, those phonological awareness skills, moving all the way up the ladder to the phoneme. She talked about phonics, knowing those symbols and how they work in a language. She talked about building that fluency, all the while building vocabulary and comprehension. And we want to make sure that we're comprehensive in our approach. So, that comes from that National Reading Panel report. But by 2006, we had the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth. And whenever I ask people if they know about that report, they don't. And that was the report that really focused on students who were learning English as their additional language and how, what components of literacy would be there. And the panel report says, yes, these are the components that are necessary. However, you have to keep in mind the language proficiency level of the student in first language and second language, right? You have to make those scaffolds for the language. You have to make those cross-linguistic connections. And, here's the thing. Can these students make progress? Yes. And another report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Mathematics, where there's the prompt, and this was in 2017, another focus group that looked diligently at what does it mean? What does this science of reading mean for this population of students? Another national report, 2017, that added, had those same components, right? But added to that that literacy includes writing. And so a lot of times it's listening, we want to listen and speak, and we want to read and write as a higher form of language. And having those tools available. Dr. Joshi mentioned the National Institute of Health and this U.S. Department of Education has also been very much the research arm, the Institute of Education Sciences. And we have what are called these IES practice guides. And in there, we have a lot of our studies are in there where we talk about that developing of literacy for these students to develop their literacy in elementary and middle school, but also the academic language and academic knowledge across the content areas. Every teacher is a language and literacy teacher. And so matter if we were doing math studies or social studies or science or language arts, there's language and literacy opportunities, but we have to be direct, explicit, systematic, and really approach it in that manner so that our students really do get those opportunities. So, I give you that just, as homework. To think about. And I think about too, a research project that we finished on multi-tiered system support for English learners, mtss4ls.org. And in there, we have a rubric that we adapted from the National Center of Intensive Intervention that looks at this multi-tiered system support from the lens of working with these English learners, thinking about what you heard Dr. Malone talk about, and Dr. Beiser, you heard him talking about the data, how you collect the data, what would be that approach, and also the multidisciplinary team that's involved. So everybody in the school really needs to know about how to help these students, but we do have the research. We're still learning more. I'm not saying we have all the answers, but we have enough to make recommendations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cardenas-Hagan. Superintendent Basler, any thoughts from your point of view?
So I actually, the whole series of questions that the Hunt Institute has put together today is just spot on, Michael. I can't thank the team enough, but this is truly something that I would love to address. The naysayers and the absolute roadblockers, and so just a little bit of history. Prior to me being elected as the state superintendent in North Dakota, I spent 24 years in elementary schools. So I was an elementary teacher. I was an elementary vice principal. I was a school librarian. And so about 6 years ago, I became unapologetically passionate about the science of reading. And for those of you who know me or have heard me before, I describe North Dakota as one community with a really long main street. It's who we are, and it's the nature of our fabric. And so you can imagine that when I entered back into what my colleagues and former colleagues and friends had called the reading wars and took this very firm position, they were devastated. Some of my friends were just devastated. My colleagues were like, what are you talking about? We have to love reading. This just flies in the face of all of that. And it was really the reading wars all over again. But it was so much different. And that was the communication. And so truly what we needed to do was we needed to find those early adopters. Find those early adopters where you just said, whoever it might be, I'll just say, Mrs. Smith, if that's the right way to do it, and if that's the way we're supposed to do it, why aren't we doing it? What are we waiting for? If that is what's working, why are only 30 to 40% of our students reading? And so let's figure this out and let's try it. And so you get those early adopters, and then what happens is something magical. It's not just me from the state saying it. It's not just the research saying it. It's educators, it's parents, it's student voices, lifting up those student voices that have seen the efforts pay off. In North Dakota, we really did witness then a passionate group of educators who then became the disciples and the advocates. And that was still a little bit more reminiscent of the reading wars, the passionate people on both sides of the aisle. But as we saw reading scores just continually at best flatline, but in most cases decline. I mean, how do you argue with that? And that's the promise that we make. I mean, a lot of parents talk about they want their children to have well-rounded experiences. They want them to be safe. Yes, but they never mention reading and math, because that is the unwritten, unspoken expectation that when every family member sends their child to school, that of course you're going to teach them to read, right? We don't even need to mention that. And when we weren't meeting that expectation for over 60% of our families and students, that was not okay. And so seeing is believing. And that's truly what we had to do. After we got those early adopters and we had reached that tipping point and we had the mechanisms in place to provide the training and the funding, North Dakota made it a requirement, made the science of reading a requirement for all of our elementary and our building principals, and actually for, in some degree, not to a real deep degree, but every educator, every content educator in our state, K through 12, and in our preparation programs. And so once they learned about the science of reading, because they were required to, they were actually stunned to learn the difference that it made and the purposefulness. And, the basic argument is teacher X, teacher Y, you are going to work really hard for 9 months. Do you want to work really hard, making a huge difference, or just work really hard and still feel the same sort of disappointment that they weren't able? Teachers, as we've heard the stories, they have literally shed tears knowing now what they didn't know then about all of the children that they felt that they had lost and that they felt that they hadn't served. And so I would just say, seeing is believing. Get those early adopters, do what you can, lift up those stories, and really just continue to support them and say, it's not about you doing anything wrong before. It's just, we know more than we did before. And once you know more, you must do more.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. Dr. Joshi, I'd love to send this question to you to close us out with this portion of the session.
Okay, I will try. Couple of people have asked the question, and Michael also phrased it in the chat box, mainly talking about the science of reading relating to educator preparation programs. We have done a lot of work in this area, and Julia, if I can share the screen, I will quickly go over if I can share the screen. Can you let me do it, or
Let's
Okay.
see if we can get that set up for you.
Okay, basically, this comes relating to what the teacher preparation program does. And so we have done some research on why our classroom teachers don't have the understanding or why our kids are failing. And so for that, not the classroom teacher, but the university professors, these have PhDs, but they don't know science of reading. And these are all shown and demonstrated in research, and we call it the Peter effect in teacher preparation. Peter effect refers to the Apostle Peter when he was asked to give some money. Peter replied, "How can I give you money when I myself don't have any?" And so the university professors themselves don't have the complete knowledge of science of reading. It has to come from there. And I may lose my job for talking like this, but that is the fact. We have shown that in research. For instance,
Did we lose him? I think we might have lost Dr. Joshi. But he was on the right track. And certainly, I certainly want to extend this question while we wait for Dr. Joshi
Yes.
to log back in. I would certainly love to extend the question to our other panelists, which is really what is the role of educator preparation programs
Yes.
in this conversation? And Dr. Cardenas-Hagan.
Yes. Fortunately, through the Hunt Institute, I've had this wonderful opportunity to work with state departments in that path forward. And it has been so fascinating to look at their data. And it's kind of like what Dr. Joshi was alluding to just now, that some states are looking at this and they find that what they're finding is that the actual institutions that prepare our teachers are not actually teaching a comprehensive approach to literacy. And as you saw, Dr. Joshi's slide is showing that also they may not have, all the, knowledge that they need. And so some innovative things that I've seen at some of these, just like their plan of what they're doing is first they start with, what does our data show us? What do we know about our universities? And through that accreditation process, they're starting to not just have all this paper submitted to get accredited, but instead looking very carefully as, how many courses do you have in reading? What is in those courses? And can we take a look at that? And can we survey the students themselves? And also, when your students are graduating, if we have a comprehensive teacher knowledge test, what is that going to show us, right? At least we start with that foundation. But what's very interesting is watching these state departments work with higher education and trying to really, what they found was, 2/3 of their universities in one particular state did not really teach a comprehensive approach. Only 1/3 did. And, so how are they going to get there? Through that accreditation process, through that, really, digging in there and looking. But the other thing is, we know what states do, and maybe this is what was done in North Dakota, I don't know, but was really taking that. But when we do these initiatives, for example, I'm in the state of Texas, and since 1998, we've been teaching the science of reading to all teachers. And we started with kindergarten, first grade, second grade. But now when we do these reading academies, we're having the principals there, we're having the literacy coaches, we're doing demonstrations, they're having to show and demonstrate that they can do this with their portfolios. We're looking at the data, but also what's so very essential is having, those professors. We did an initiative where the university professors went through the initiative with us. And so that's very important so that they can learn about what do we know. And so it's just very hard when, you're in a university to just, to keep up with everything. But states are getting very wise. They're looking carefully. And as Dr. Joshi mentioned, they're looking at, why don't they know the information? What can we do about that information? And then what can we do about, you all talked about screeners, you talked about curriculum. Can we do a very thorough review? Yeah, the curriculum, it's, teachers teach, but at least we can start with something that maybe covers all those components in some kind of fashion. I'm going to teach, I'm going to be knowledgeable enough because you trained me to know what my students need, but I need some resources that really do follow that. I think we have Dr. Joshi back there. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had mentioned my internet connection going off. Well, what I was telling, basically the colleges of education have to be responsible for this. And I don't know, I was just going to share one last slide. I don't know whether we have that. Can you see my screen? Can I?
You cannot, but you're welcome to try to reshare. Oh, no, we may have lost.
Did we lose him again?
Might have lost him again. As I was saying before we started, this technology is supposed to make things easier, but oftentimes it really just makes things a lot harder.
Yeah.
Dr. Malone or Superintendent Basler would love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, we can certainly move the conversation along.
So I'm just going to double down on what Dr. Cardenas-Hagan and Dr. Joshi have said, and just thank you for saying those things out loud. The approach that we took from K-12, I'm a big believer in change the things that you have control over, and I didn't have control over K-12, or I probably don't have control over K-12 either, but I had more opportunity to inform and guide and support K-12 than higher ed. So we started there. Part of the legislation did require that the new EPPs, but it was really light, the light on the requirements of EPPs. And essentially, I think our EPPs were able to, education preparation programs, were able to actually not change much of what they were doing. But I loved the reference to the Peter effect of you just really truly can. And I understand the reading teachers have been the ones that have been writing the articles about how to teach reading for decades. And so now to say that maybe they don't have everything that they need to do this, that's a conversation that is tough to have, but it's necessary to have. And so we are moving into that space now, working, through, again, I'm much more about a carrot and a stick and a partnership, a carrot than a stick and a partnership, and how do we do this together? But now that we're seeing our teachers that have received this training in the science of reading, they're just feeling so much more successful and so much more professional about the results that they're getting. And our preparation programs are seeing that their recent and veteran graduates are feeling more professional and more successful in that reading role. And so they're saying, what can we do? And so we're at that point now. And I just really love some of the suggestions that I've heard here today to encourage that growth and that partnership.
Thank you so much. And with the time we have left, I'd love to ask one final question, both to you, Superintendent Basler, but also I would love to hear your thoughts, Dr. Malone, which is really, as we talk about the science of reading and evidence-based literacy instruction, what is the role of parents and families? How can we bring them into this conversation and reinforce these evidence-based strategies?
First of all, I think we have a huge lesson learned from not listening to our parents. For decades, we had parents and family members, and I hate to just use parents. We've taught, you probably, those of you that know me, I don't use parents because then you just kind of exclude aunts and uncles and grandparents. And so family members for decades have been going to their schools and saying something's wrong. Something's wrong. And we just kind of gave them a pat on the hand and said, they're there. It'll be okay. They'll learn to love reading. And we'll just do that. We haven't listened to parents, and I think we're paying the price. We haven't listened to family members, and we're paying the price. I said this earlier. If we were able to do this alone as educators, why haven't we done it? What are we waiting for? And so that bridge from family, home to school is absolutely critical. Ask them what they're seeing at home. Ask them what they might be noticing. Encourage. It's family engagement is far much more than just having a family fun night and inviting parents to the school. And I would say communication is not us telling how parents can help the school. Family engagement has to be about ensuring that we are listening to those family members on what they are seeing and what they need. And we also share with them with what we see and what we need as educators. So if there's any investment that's going to help this, in addition to the science of reading, it is engaging our families. And to the EL portion, communicate to them in the way that they can understand and draw on that strength. I'll just quickly close out that the National Teacher of the Year is a math high school teacher from Oklahoma. And she is a US citizen, but she came to us as a new American, and her mother is Swedish and her father is Iranian. So she came to our public school system as a third grader and was speaking Swedish and Persian, Farsi. And her third grade teacher said, "You are not disadvantaged. You are linguistically gifted. You get to speak 3 languages. You are not as a deficit." So I would say if we begin to approach that as an asset, speaking another language as an asset focus versus a deficit focus, we'll be far better off as a country, especially we'll be far better servants to our students.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. Dr. Malone.
Yeah, I will absolutely echo that and reiterate that parents are the first advocates for their kids, and we need to listen from early literacy all the way up to the high school experience. I also want to address very quickly the early literacy continuum where parents do play a critical role. And I am a staunch advocate of just continue to read with your child. Have your child make up stories about what you are seeing and hearing and listening to, and try to identify, do they have those early literacy skills? Can they differentiate words and sentences verbally and then maybe eventually on paper? Can they hear individual letter sounds? Can they tell you that a particular letter makes multiple sounds? Those kinds of things. Those are crosswalks where we can have parents help us in the process, but we also need to open our school doors to open communication across parent lines so that we understand where gaps may lie and we can capitalize on the strengths of each individual students to bring them to where they need to be. I know we're out of time, so.
No, what a incredible bow on the conversation, Dr. Malone. And really, I would love to thank Superintendent Basler, Dr. Joshi, Dr. Cardenas-Hagan, and you, Dr. Malone, for joining us for today's conversation, really getting to the heart about how literacy is at the root of all learning. Again, I really appreciate you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. So before I close out today's discussion, I do want to turn everyone's attention to our upcoming K-12 webinars. Our next conversation will be on Thursday, June 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where education leaders from across the country will join us for a incredible discussion on high dosage tutoring initiatives. It'll be a great conversation, so please be sure to register for that if you're interested. And we also encourage you to join us for our entire slate of upcoming webinars, which are listed on your screen in front of you. You can register for these discussions by going to our website, which we will also post in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And with that, thank you all once again for joining us today. Thank you to our incredible panelists, and we really hope to see you again soon.